King Charles had entered the private meeting, expecting a routine explanation about royal property. Instead, a senior crown lawyer opened a century-old register, placed one marked page before him, and revealed a clause capable of overturning everything he believed about the Duchy of Cornwall. Charles read the final sentence twice. Then he lowered the paper, stared across the table, and discovered that no words would come. But before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The silence tightened. William sat opposite his father, watching the monarch's face change as the lawyer explained why it mattered. The Duchy of Cornwall, an inherited estate controlled by the sovereign's eldest living son to fund the heir's duties and household, had once been Charles's proudest domain. He had shaped its farms, charities, communities, and environmental projects for decades. He believed he knew the rules governing it. The lawyer turned the register toward William. A long-hidden succession clause stated that personal directives made by a former duke became void after he ascended the throne, unless the new duke renewed them within 90 days. The prince felt the weight immediately. He had inherited more than land. Without realizing it, he had gained the power to approve or reject his father's unfinished instructions. Charles reached for the document again. Several orders he believed were active could have expired. Decisions involving charitable funding, private residences, land, and advisors who had served him for years. The loss was not merely administrative. Those instructions carried promises, and broken promises could damage the trust he had spent a lifetime building. William chose his words carefully. "Was I ever shown the renewal instrument?" he asked. The lead lawyer opened a documented transition account, the official record tracking papers passed between royal households during succession, and pointed to an empty entry. The 90-day deadline had closed shortly after Queen Elizabeth's death. No renewal had been signed, because the document had never reached the new duke. Charles finally spoke. His voice was low. "Who removed it?" No one answered. Then the lawyer produced a copied file log and explained that the missing papers had last been handled by a senior palace official connected to the king's former household. William asked to see every directive affected by the clause. His father turned away, because both men understood that the list might expose something more personal than property. But before the lawyers could reveal what had vanished with those unsigned papers, Charles and William had to confront the painful truth that the duchy was no longer merely an estate. It had become a test of trust between a king and his heir. The legal clause did not simply transfer authority, it forced 2 generations of the monarchy into a position neither could escape. Charles saw the duchy as the work of his adult life, shaped through decades of criticism, patience, and relentless control. William saw it as an inheritance, carrying invisible promises he had never made. Now the father wanted continuity, while the son was being told that the law demanded choice. Charles stood beside the window, while William studied the list of expired instructions. The Duchy of Cornwall, an inherited estate used to support the sovereign's eldest son and his official duties, had been more than income to the king. He had used its farms, villages, architectural projects, and charities to prove that tradition could change without losing its soul. That mattered, because every cancelled order threatened real families, jobs, and promises built over decades. William turned another page. He had inherited the estate the moment his father became sovereign, yet no preparation had warned him that he would become the legal gatekeeper of decisions Charles believed were already safe. The prince spoke carefully. Responsibility, he said, could not mean signing every instruction without review. His caution was measured, but the king heard something harsher: rejection. Charles did not face him. He reminded his son that tenants had trusted his word, charities had planned around his support, and advisors had built careers around those commitments. William answered that trust also required transparency. The future king could preserve good work, but he would not approve hidden obligations simply because they came from his father. Camilla found Charles alone after the meeting, still gripping the marked legal page. The queen consort asked what frightened him most. He admitted that becoming king had cost him control of the one institution where he had always felt certain. She touched his hand, but he barely reacted. William then discovered 2 directives that changed the tension completely. One granted lifelong occupancy of a protected residence to an unnamed royal relative under a coded property designation. Another moved a large annual sum into a private foundation outside normal duchy oversight. Charles had approved the recipient personally, but the heir had never reviewed it. The prince requested the original transition file at once. An archivist replied through a documented internal account that several pages had been removed after a tense royal gathering held only weeks before the accession. Her warning carried a wound. The removal had followed an argument involving the residence, the foundation, and someone inside their family. The missing pages had not disappeared by accident, and the gathering where they were last seen would expose the exact moment a private disagreement became a constitutional trap. Every royal crisis has a moment that seems ordinary until history turns back and marks it as the point of no return. In this story, that moment came during an estate dinner at Highgrove, when a disagreement over one protected property ended with a folder being carried from the room. No announcement followed, no alarm was raised. Yet inside that folder rested the signatures that could have prevented the king's humiliation. Charles had spent the final months of Queen Elizabeth's reign preparing for an inheritance he believed would be orderly. Officials drafted renewal forms for staffing, leases, environmental programs, and community commitments. The accession, the moment a new monarch takes the throne, would transfer the duchy to William, but several personal instructions could survive only with the new duke's written consent. That mattered because families, employees, and charities were depending on those promises. The breaking point came at Highgrove. Charles told William that a duchy-owned residence would remain available indefinitely to Camilla's relatives for family use. The prince objected. He argued that inherited royal property could not become an extension of the sovereign's household because the arrangement felt loyal or convenient. Charles placed his pen down. The gesture ended the warmth in the room. He insisted that the residence honored people who had stood beside him for years, but William refused to surrender the principle. Loyalty, he said, did not remove the need for transparent authority. Camilla heard enough to understand that her family stood at the center of the dispute. She left before dessert, then told the king in a recorded conversation that she would not become the reason father and son stopped trusting one another. The dinner ended, but the danger remained. A senior household official collected the duchy transition folder and said Charles wanted the sensitive residence papers separated from the routine forms. No written instructions supported that claim. The renewal instrument, the document William needed to sign to keep the orders alive, was placed inside a private red box rather than the succession file. When the Queen died, that box stayed sealed in a storage room controlled by the former prince's household. William listened as the retired archivist gave her documented account. Shame tightened her voice. She admitted that she had watched the folder leave and stayed silent because she believed it would be restored the next morning. Then she looked toward the door and revealed that the official who moved it still served inside the palace and was waiting outside to explain himself. When the door opened, the mystery of the missing papers became a confrontation, and Charles was forced to face the person whose quiet decision had stripped his wishes of legal force. There was no grand council chamber and no ceremonial distance to protect them. Only Charles, William, 2 lawyers, and the official accused of removing the renewal document. The king remained seated at first, listening as the explanation unfolded. Then a single sentence changed his expression. The papers had not been lost. They had been deliberately withheld because someone believed William would refuse to sign them. The official drew a careful breath. Queen Elizabeth's declining health, he explained, had forced palace staff to prepare for several possible constitutional outcomes at once. A constitutional transition meant the legal transfer of duties, titles, and authority after a sovereign's death. Every delay mattered, because one missing signature could alter property rights, funding promises, and the future duke's control. Charles listened, as the man claimed that the private directives had been separated to prevent a family explosion. William was already carrying fear for his grandmother, anxiety about succession, and growing doubts about the residence arrangement. The courtier insisted he had tried to protect both men from a confrontation at the worst possible moment. The king rose slowly. His anger did not need volume. He demanded to know who had given one servant the right to decide what his heir could see. William stepped in before the official answered. He refused to let the man carry every ounce of blame, then turned toward his father, and asked whether an honest refusal would ever have been accepted. Charles hesitated. That pause wounded William more than any accusation. The prince understood that the documents had been withheld because someone feared his independence, but now he wondered whether that fear had begun with the king himself. Charles struck the table once with his open hand, shifting the legal register. "You had no right to hide it," he told the official. Then he faced his son, and warned that certainty should not be mistaken for manipulation. William answered that secrecy had made the difference impossible to see. The official produced a handwritten note bearing Charles's initial. It ordered staff to hold the sensitive schedules until agreement is secured. The king insisted that hold meant delay, not concealment beyond the accession. The lawyers warned that the wording could still suggest an attempt to bypass the new duke's independent authority. Camilla entered after hearing the raised voices. The queen consort saw the coded residence designation and understood immediately that her family arrangement had helped ignite the crisis. She did not defend herself. Instead, she asked whether William could now cancel every disputed instruction at once. The lawyers answered yes. Because William did not merely possess the right to reject his father's old decisions, under the hidden clause, he now held the power to replace them with decisions of his own. The revelation did not crown William victorious. It burdened him with something far more dangerous: legitimate power over his father's unfinished legacy. Every signature could be interpreted as obedience. Every refusal could be seen as rebellion. As Charles watched the lawyers outline the heir's authority, the old balance between them quietly disappeared. For the first time, the king had to request control over something he once commanded without question. William remained seated after the room emptied. The duchy's historic framework, the rules separating the heir's estate from the monarch's direct command, gave him control over every policy his father had failed to renew. That boundary mattered, because the crown could not simply restore those orders without weakening the future king's independence and turning inheritance into obedience. The prince removed his jacket, loosened his tie, and opened the files one by one. Names filled the pages: tenants, advisors, charities, employees, and families whose futures now rested on his pen. Power had arrived without triumph. It felt heavy, personal, and dangerously easy to misuse. Charles sent a handwritten message before midnight. He asked his son to preserve the charitable programs before judging the private arrangements. William understood the appeal, yet the note unsettled him. The king was still trying to influence the decision outside the legal process, even while claiming to respect it. Catherine found William staring at the same page minutes later. She urged him not to turn the crisis into a battle he had to win. Rejecting everything, she warned, would punish communities that knew nothing about hidden folders or palace rivalries. The princess reminded him that strength could mean protecting good work while ending bad control. William then reached the financial schedules. One expired directive guaranteed an annual payment to an advisory office created by Charles, despite that office answering to neither the current duke nor independent reviewers. Another clause would have allowed the former duke to retain consultative influence after accession, meaning the sovereign could still shape major estate decisions from behind the heir's authority. The prince took up a fountain pen. He circled one directive to preserve, another to suspend, and a third to terminate. His hand paused above the protected residence arrangement, but he left it untouched. By morning, Charles received the first formal decision. It did not target Camilla, property, or money. William had chosen the advisory office. By canceling it, he would preserve his father's public achievements, while removing the private channel through which old loyalties could continue directing the new duke. The first rejection would reveal that William was not targeting Camilla, property, or money. He was striking at the hidden mechanism that had allowed trust to be replaced by control. At 9 o'clock the next morning, a sealed duchy notice arrived at Buckingham Palace. Charles opened it privately, expecting to find the residence agreement revoked. Instead, William had cancelled the advisory office through which the former prince's aides continued influencing estate decisions. The king read the order in silence. It was not an attack on Camilla. It was something more personal, a declaration that Charles's era inside the duchy was officially over. Charles kept reading. The advisory office, a privately funded group created to guide estate policy, would be dissolved immediately, and every future recommendation would pass through the current duchy leadership. Long-serving members of his former team were told that their authority had ended. The decision mattered because it severed the private channel linking the monarch to an estate he no longer controlled. William had not destroyed everything. The prince protected the charitable and environmental programs for 6 months, giving communities, employees, and tenants time to breathe while each commitment was reviewed. That pause mattered, because sudden cancellation could have cost jobs and broken promises made to families far beyond palace walls. Charles turned to Camilla with the notice still in his hand. He told the queen consort that he had spent half his life being mocked for ideas that were now praised, only to lose the right to defend them once they had finally succeeded. She refused to feed his anger. William had preserved the work, she said, but removed the people who had hidden the papers. He was separating legacy from control. One former advisor understood the message before noon. He cleared his desk, placed an old duchy seal into a wooden box, and left through a side entrance while younger staff watched without speaking. His departure made the transfer real. An era had not merely weakened. It had ended. William then ordered an independent audit, a formal outside review of money and decisions, covering every payment approved during the 90-day transition. The review found that certain funds had continued moving under Charles's old instructions after the hidden clause had made them invalid. Lawyers warned that the money might require repayment or formal approval. No crime was suggested, but the embarrassment threatened the monarchy's claim of careful stewardship. Anne confronted Charles privately that afternoon. She told her brother that anger would make it appear he had expected William to act as a caretaker rather than an independent heir. The king said nothing. That evening, the prince requested a meeting with his father alone. For the first time since the clause was exposed, the crisis moved beyond signatures and legal authority, leaving only a father, a son, and the truth neither had been willing to say aloud. There were no lawyers in the room when William arrived. No advisors waiting beyond the door. Charles had removed the duchy papers from the table, leaving only 2 glasses of water and the silence that had grown between them. The king expected another negotiation. Instead, William began with a confession. He had never wanted to erase his father's legacy. He only wanted the freedom to inherit it honestly. Charles listened without interrupting. Clarence House, the king's London residence, had been chosen as neutral ground, away from palace legal offices and duchy headquarters. That mattered, because neither man wanted titles, staff, or procedure to speak for them. The dispute had grown beyond one hidden clause. It now asked whether succession meant obedience to the past or responsibility for the future. William admitted that the missing papers had wounded him more than the legal problem itself. The prince feared his father had never trusted him to make a difficult choice. Charles looked down and answered with equal honesty. He had feared his son would reject the arrangements simply to prove that the estate now belonged to him. The king then revealed the deeper truth in a recorded private account, later preserved for the royal archive. The advisory clause had been created because losing the duchy felt like losing the most meaningful work of his life. Becoming sovereign had fulfilled destiny, yet it had also taken away the place where he had felt useful, tested, and understood. William slid the protected residence agreement across the table. He had not cancelled it. Instead, the future king had rewritten it as a 5-year private lease, subject to normal review, preserving dignity without creating permanent privilege. He also offered Charles 1 honorary consultation each year, allowing advice on environmental and community projects without restoring hidden control. Charles accepted, but only on one condition. Every renewed directive would be recorded internally, reviewed by lawyers, and signed by William without pressure from the sovereign's household. The king picked up the pen and signed a statement surrendering all informal influence over the duchy. Then he passed it across. William signed beneath him. The gesture did not erase the betrayal, but it stopped the fracture from becoming permanent. Father and son had finally chosen honesty over control. Yet outside that quiet room, the secret was already moving toward the public. When the palace finally acknowledged the discovery, one legal sentence escaped the private room and became a national debate about inheritance, accountability, and the true limits of royal power. By sunrise, The secret no longer belonged to the palace. The hidden clause was splashed across Britain in language impossible to ignore. The king's orders had expired, the heir had refused to restore them, and the duchy had exposed a boundary inside royal power that few people knew existed. Yet one image captured the moment more powerfully than any legal analysis. Charles leaving church while William walked several steps behind him. The palace moved quickly. Officials released a carefully worded statement, confirming that historic duchy instruments had been reviewed after a succession-related administrative omission. Those instruments were formal documents governing the estate's powers and obligations. The message stressed that charitable programs, community commitments, and tenant protections would continue because families and workers could not be punished for a failure inside royal administration. Broadcasters treated the story as a test of accountability rather than a threat to the crown. They explained that inherited institutions could still contain legal checks, even within the royal family. That mattered, because the dispute showed the monarch could not simply command an heir's independent estate, and because William's authority carried real limits on his father's influence. The Daily Chronicle captured the shock with a full-width headline, "The King Who Could Not Command His Own Legacy." Beneath it, Charles held a service sheet while the prince looked toward him from the church steps. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered. One sign declared, "A future king must be free to choose." Another called the monarch's lost authority, a cruel price for a lifetime of service. Charles watched the broadcast alone until Camilla entered. The Queen Consort switched off the television when commentators suggested his achievements had depended on secret control. She reminded him that surrendering authority by choice would matter more than losing it by accident. Elsewhere, Catherine steadied William as critics accused him of humiliating his father. The princess told him transparency often looked disloyal before it began to look responsible. The palace then released a joint duchy declaration signed by both men. It accepted the clause, protected essential programs, and permanently ended hidden advisory influence. During a public engagement, William was asked whether he had defeated the king. "There was nothing to defeat," he answered. "There was something to put right." The statement calmed the argument, but Charles knew public wording could not settle the wound. He had to decide whether the clause would vanish into secrecy again or remain visible as a warning to future sovereigns. The king could have buried the document again, blamed those who concealed it, or rewritten the story around himself. But his final decision transformed humiliation into something the monarchy had rarely offered so openly: accountability. The crisis ended not with a victory for Charles or William, but with the surrender of an illusion. The king had believed that decades of service entitled his wishes to survive unchanged. The heir had feared that independence required rejection. The hidden clause shattered both assumptions. What emerged was more difficult, more honest, and ultimately more powerful. A monarchy in which love could not replace consent, and inheritance could not erase responsibility. Charles made his final choice in writing. He ordered the disputed clause, the missed deadline, and every corrected agreement preserved inside the royal archives, the official collection where historic royal records are protected for future generations. That mattered, because hiding the papers again would repeat the same failure, while preserving them would turn embarrassment into a lesson no future household could ignore. The king also approved new succession procedures. Every duchy transition instrument, a formal document transferring estate powers and obligations, would be independently logged, delivered directly to the incoming duke, and reviewed without interference from the outgoing household. The change protected William's authority and ensured that personal loyalty could never again outrank legal responsibility. Charles then met the former advisors whose positions had been dissolved. He thanked them for years of service, but he admitted that devotion to him could not excuse withholding information from his son. William answered with restraint rather than triumph. The prince preserved the strongest charitable, farming, environmental, and community programs, publicly crediting his father for building the foundation he now intended to modernize. Camilla accepted the 5-year residence lease without protest. The Queen Consort personally asked her relatives to respect the new duke's authority, while the financial audit confirmed that disputed payments could be corrected through formal approval and repayment adjustments. By admitting the administrative failure, the monarchy avoided a deeper legal scandal. The final moment came at their first annual consultation. Charles arrived with no private file and no list of demands. William placed the duchy report between them and asked, "Where would you begin?" The king paused, then answered as an advisor rather than an owner. The clause had not weakened him. It had tested whether he could accept a limit with dignity. William had not defeated his father. He had proved that continuity must be examined, chosen, and earned. Charles finally let his greatest work pass honestly into the future ahead. And so the sentence that first left the king without words became the sentence that clarified his legacy. The crown could preserve tradition, but only trust could carry it forward. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.